Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. Hey listeners, let's start with a little bit of fun. Okay, if I say the word creed, what first comes to your mind? Are you thinking of that 90s rock band or the character from the show The Office? Are you thinking of that 2015 movie about Rocky Balboa? Or maybe the video game series Assassin's Creed? Or maybe the Apostles' Creed? Well, the creed that's the topic of today's conversation is one that is celebrating its 1700th birthday this year, and it's the Nicene Creed. Jim, can you take us back in time and talk a bit about the origin of the Nicene Creed?
Yeah. After Jesus came, lived, died, resurrected, and returned to heaven, the followers of Jesus, left with marching orders to take his message out into the world, exploded in growth. And that meant they didn't just explode demographically, numerically, they also exploded geographically. They spread out all over the place. So the question became, for the early church, the challenge, how would they stay united? How would this fast-growing, quickly expanding movement remain unified in vision and values and mission and purpose and such? Remember, this was before websites. This was before Zoom meetings. There was, long distance between cities. It was done by donkey or foot. I mean, it just was a much tougher thing than you would imagine. So they did it largely in three ways. First, there was organized leadership throughout the growing Christian movement. The early church began calling their leaders bishops or the episcopate. And so bishops were put in place to oversee geographic areas of the church and to work in conjunction with other bishops. They were identified, they were appointed, they were recognized leaders. So that kept the church unified. Second, there were obviously the scriptures. Shared scriptures unique to the Christian movement began to be circulated largely through two collections. One collection was the fourfold biography or gospel of the life and teaching of Jesus as recorded by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Second, there was a collection of the writings of the Apostle Paul and the other apostles. Together, the four gospels of Jesus and the writings of the apostles form what we call the New Testament, and those are shared scriptures being circulated around the churches. So the New Testament was a binding force. But then came a third unifying force. There began to be short summaries of what it meant to be a Christian, of what you had to affirm to join a Christian congregation or to be affirmed as someone who had truly embraced the Christian faith. They became known as creeds. And the word, and from the Latin credo, or we would say in English credo, both are accurate pronunciations. But credo simply means we believe. And that was the opening line of the Nicene Creed. And we've been calling those kinds of statements creeds ever since, simply because it was the opening line of that particular statement, which tells you the power of the Nicene Creed and how influential it was. But anyway, those creeds were formulated by the bishops. They were based on the scriptures. Some people don't like creeds. They feel like it's something added to the Bible. In fact, sometimes you'll hear people say, no creed but the Bible, like a militant term. And I always say, look, the leaders of the early church would have agreed with you. They would have said no creed but the Bible too. They were all for that. They just, but the challenge was that they needed to make sure that people were getting what the Bible said. And it was like they were people were spouting off all these verses and passages and sections and in ways that just didn't reflect Jesus or what the apostles had actually taught. It was as if they had this shared vocabulary, but they did not have a shared dictionary. And they needed a dictionary to go along with the vocabulary. So creeds were these short distillations of the message of the Christian faith to ensure that everyone was on the same page about what the biblical message of the Christian faith was. In the Greek language, they were called symbolons, a word which originally meant half of something. And I found this really interesting when I was digging into this in some of my own research, that I didn't know this before, but that this was also another word used for the creeds, but it has an interesting background. A symbolon is that you would take like a pot, like a craft pottery. You break it in half. And let's say that you were going to send a courier with an important message or document or money, a payment, something, and you were going to send it to this other person over here, and you just wanted to make sure that they recognize each other. And again, this was before this was a long time ago. How are you going to do that? So you give one piece of this broken pottery to maybe the courier and one person to the recipient, and then when they got together, they would combine those two, and if they fit, then you knew you had a verification of someone's identity. That half of something broken matched with the other half that was broken. And so if they came together, then you had that. It was called a symbolon. It's where we get our word symbol, which is interesting. So the idea is that if you joined yourself as one half with the creed as the other half, and it fit, then you were identified as a Christian. You were verified as a Christian. In other words, if you didn't match up with the creed, if your beliefs didn't match up with the creed, if what you said you believed in, if you couldn't support it, if you couldn't agree with it, if you couldn't sign off on it, you couldn't embrace it. In other words, if who you are as a piece didn't match up with the creed's piece, then your identity as a Christian wasn't verified. You weren't confirmed as a Christian. So you had leaders, you had scriptures, and you had the creeds, keeping the early growing, expanding Christian movement together. In the year 325, the very first ecumenical or worldwide gathering of Christian leaders took place in the town of Nicaea. Nicaea was chosen because actually Constantine, the Roman emperor, pulled this group together, and that was near where he was, and he wanted it to be near where he was because he wanted to participate. He wanted to listen in and watch. So Nicaea was picked for that reason, an ancient town in what is now in the country of Turkey. From that first council, they produced a statement that forever became known as the Nicene Creed, named after the city in which they met. In terms of importance, really, there's not a single list of the most significant events in Christian history that leaves it off. And it doesn't just make the top 100 or the top 50, the top 25, or even the top 10. In terms of consequential actions taken by the leaders of the Christian movement, you could argue for other events like maybe the dispersion from Jerusalem and things like that. But those were not purposeful actions done by Christian leaders. That was just stuff that happened. In terms of what Christian leaders consciously did as leaders in the Christian movement in all of times following Jesus, Nicene Creed is number one. Nothing comes close. Number one. So that's the significance of it.
Yeah. Now, if memory serves me correctly, there was a particular reason, right, why Constantine wanted to put together that gathering. Perhaps like a particular issue that the church was facing, or maybe a heresy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Ooh, there certainly was. There was a man who lived during that time named Arius. And he argued that the scriptural titles for Christ, which pointed to Christ's equality with God, he called them courtesy titles, kind of very dismissive of them. In truth, Arius said Christ was to be seen as a creature. He would say, maybe even a perfect creature, maybe even one that outranked all the other creatures. He said, but he's a creature nonetheless, created like everyone and everything else. And he had a famous phrase that was kind of his big sugar stick heart of his sermons and his messages. There was once when he was not, was his phrase. And he even made it into a little like tune sing-song thing that make it catchy. There was once when he was not. We don't know what the tune was, but he put it to some kind of musical thing. And he went around the country getting people to believe that and spreading that message. Arius and his followers maintained that Jesus was similar to the Father in nature or essence, but not the same as the Father in nature or essence. And that's received a swift, hostile reaction, and deservedly so. Not only did it go against what the Christian faith knew and believed from the very beginning, it went against what was clearly taught in the scriptures, it went against who Jesus himself claimed to be, but even just from a common sense standpoint, it went against the very nature of salvation. I mean, it was known that the divinity of Jesus was of central importance to the Christian idea of salvation itself. I mean, if what he was maintaining was true, Jesus couldn't save anybody because no mere creature can save another creature. Only God can save. And according to the New Testament, salvation was meant to come through Jesus. And even Arius had to admit that. And he was kind of cornered on that one. So a council was convened of all of the bishops of the Christian world, largely Eastern bishops, but Western bishops as well. But in that day and time, it was a worldwide convocation of them in the town of Nicaea in the year 325. It was in the summer. of the 325. My memory, I can't remember whether it started in May or June, but it was in summer of 325, and to put it to rest. And the issue was deemed so important, and lasted for multiple days, and it was worked out a lot of different things, and worked on a lot of different things. But it was so important that it was, as I said, convened by Constantine, the Roman emperor, who himself had become a Christian about a decade earlier. It was the first worldwide, that's what ecumenical means, first ecumenical or / worldwide Christian council in history. And as I would often kind of tease my graduate students to get them interested in it, I said, even Santa Claus was there. St. Nicholas of Turkey, the historical figure that gave rise to who we now call Santa Claus, was in attendance. And the council did not result in a simple conclusion like they had to debate about it. That would make it seem like it was a matter of confusion, that they were unclear what to think until they gathered together, and it was just decided he was going to be divine. No. It resulted in a clear, decisive, definitive verdict, an indictment. It resulted in a creed, a statement that would be sent around the world to make things clear. That was the purpose, to put this to rest, not to wrestle with it, to put it to rest. It was not a question of, whether he was right. And that creed, among other things, made it clear. By the way, this is an aside, which is what makes so many historians and others just almost want to take every novel Dan Brown ever wrote and throw it against the wall, because he tries to make Nicaea sound like everybody felt like Arius and that it was a close vote. And they just invented the divinity of Christ at the Council of Nicaea, which is absolutely historical revisionism at its worst. It just simply is not true. Just no historian of any stature would do anything. Even non-Christians would laugh at that. It's just simply not true. But that creed, among other things, made it clear that Jesus was God himself in human form, the second person of the Trinity, and any other view is heresy of the highest order. In other words, they essentially said, hey, we believe that Jesus was who he said he was. We're just going to, he was who he said he was. Specifically, it was determined that, and here, sometimes people get confused about the language. The Nicene Creed was written in Greek. It was later translated into Latin, and many times it's the Latin that we make our translations from, and we get our word credo from, but it was actually written in Greek. And so the Greek language that they wrestled with in trying to get this across was, it was determined that Jesus was homoousios. Homo, same, ousios, substance. A one in being, one in substance with the Father. That was selected as opposed to the heresy of saying he was homoi ousios, meaning of like substance, like being. In Gibbon's monumental work, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, he says there's never been so much energy, so much importance put on one vowel, that inserted I in the English. That vowel mattered because it defined the very person of Christ. So historic Christian orthodoxy was upheld, and Arianism was condemned as heresy. And to this day, the Nicene Creed, which was confirmed and expanded by the Council of Constantinople in 381 to include a statement about the third member of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit. The original Nicene Creed ended with saying about the divinity of the Holy Spirit, but because of other heresies, they expanded that a little bit in 381 to make sure that was clear. But it's the only creed that receives universal affirmation by the entire Christian movement in its final form, that both the 325 version and the 381. It's the only truly worldwide authoritative statement of the Christian faith that all of Christendom has embraced now for 1,700 years. And when I say all, I mean, we're talking the Catholic Church, we're talking about the Eastern Orthodox Church, we're talking about the Anglican Communion, Protestant Church. I mean, the only two, and these are not Christian sects and Christian groups, but the only two kind of world religions or religions that people might associate with Christianity, but they're not Christian. I don't mind saying that they're not Christian, that don't accept the Nicene Creed, are Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. But I would not put them in the Christian category anyway. But this is the gold standard that all look to.
Well, if we fast forward a bit, I'm thinking of our church, Mecklenburg Community Church, where you serve as a senior pastor and where I also serve. We're not a creedal church in that we don't recite any creeds on a regular basis. And yet,
Boy, let's not make that what a creedal church is, but keep going.
Yes. Okay. Just stick with me for a moment. But I guess what's interesting is that you're actually, our listeners may not realize this, but you're walking through a series right now that's devoted entirely to the Nicene Creed. So why is that?
For the same reason it was important at that time. And I kind of played with you a little bit because, and we can talk more about this later, but a creedal church is, you can be very creedal, but never recite the creed like you would in a liturgical church. I would say we're not a liturgical church, but we're deeply creedal. But we can get to that. But it was important at the time, and it's important since then, and it's been important throughout time. This statement has, and there are two reasons. First, as mentioned, was simply the spread of the church. The bigger it got and the more spread out it became, the more clear statements of the Christian faith and what it entailed were needed. You can think of it this way, and I did mention this actually in the opening of our series. I kind of was trying to get across to people why a creed was so necessary. And I said, have you ever played that game where someone starts off whispering something in somebody's ear? And then they whisper in the ear of the person next to them, and the next to them, and on it goes. And at the end of the circle or the line, the person at the end has got to say what they heard whispered in their ear, and then it's compared to what was actually said. And it's usually distorted and all messed up. And so you can imagine how something would come out not after 15 whispers, but after millions of whispers, and how that could be garbled through transmission. And so, because how distorted things could have gotten with just the sheer worldwide explosion of the Christian faith going on at that time, and I do mean explosion. I mean, you got to think about the challenge that faced the leaders that were gathered in Nicaea in 325. I mean, they had to have just been reeling with the growth of the church because by around AD 100, the best estimates are there were around 7,500 followers of Christ. By AD 310, 15 years before Nicaea, by 310 there were over 30 million. From 7,500 to 30 million. Now, 7,500 is not a lot of people. 30 million is. 30 million would be, if you were to take the 14 largest cities in the United States, combine their population, we're talking New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Phoenix, San Antonio, all the way down to Charlotte, all 14 of the largest cities in the United States, combine their entire population, that would give you 30 million. So try passing the whisper message around that many people and see how distorted it could get. So no wonder the Nicene Creed was composed as early as 325. But that's not the only reason creeds were needed. As the early church exploded in growth and spread throughout the known world, it became vulnerable to people like Arius, spreading erroneous ideas and misapplications about the teaching of Jesus and the apostles, and which brings up two very important words that that we need to really brush off and we need to take advantage of. And sometimes I think we're scared of these words, and I wish we weren't, because they're important words, and the words are orthodoxy and heresy. Orthodoxy simply means right belief. Heresy means wrong belief. I know those are strong words, particularly the words heresy, and there's a lot of people that use the word heresy in a way that's not good. They will elevate tertiary things, secondary things, that and say, well, that's, in disagreements there, they'll call the other person heretic or heresy, and I think so you need to be careful. I really like the old line that's often attributed to Augustine, but it probably was not him, where it says, in essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, and in all things charity or love. The heresy has to do with the true essentials. And so a creed was meant to make clear what was already established, what was already known, and what was already orthodox as real heresy. In other words, that if you deny this or buy into this, you've left the Christian faith. It's not that that's an honest disagreement between two Christians. You've left the Christian faith. It can be said you were no longer Christian. You are a heretic. And in other words, somebody who is so distorted, so left the Christian faith that you cannot be called a Christian. And that's not a judgmental thing. That's just a factual thing. If you can't say what a Christian is, you can't say what a Christian isn't. If you can't say what a Christian isn't, you can't say what a Christian is. I mean, it's people who don't want to say, oh, you can't ever say anybody's a heretic. Well, what are the scriptures for? What is the revelation of Jesus for? What is truth for? I mean, as C.S. Lewis once said, you can't call a line crooked unless you know what a straight line is. And so that's what the creed was after there, and why we still need it today desperately.
I'm going to have a follow-up question about that, but let me ask another one first, because you and I both read this similar article in, I believe it was in Christianity Today, and it was titled, How the Nicene Creed Became Cool Again. I don't mean this like in a tongue-in-cheek way, but for those of us who didn't realize that it did become cool again, what did we miss?
I think that there has been for a while now a deep desire for Christians to get in touch with their roots, the history of their faith. And I think particularly among evangelical Christians in America, they had, I think that sometimes Christianity was presented to them as something that just started about 50 years ago. And when they started looking at their roots, they began to almost have a sense of dis-ease because they saw the rich traditions going back outside of American history through, the Middle Ages and the early church, and they saw how maybe the Anglican Communion or the Catholic Church kind of had this rich tradition, all this rich history, and they kind of felt like, they yearned for that, they longed for that, and they felt like, gosh, it's almost like, did what I believe just start with Billy Graham or something, and so, but the fact of the matter is that, so I think that it got cool again, if you will, because people started to be really interested in their roots and the history of their faith and realize that they did go all the way back. Protestants do. We all do. The Nicene Creed is a statement of Christian belief that came before they were Baptists, before they were Presbyterians, before they were Methodists and Anglicans, before they were Protestants and Catholics. There's something very appealing about that, and rightfully so. It goes all the way back even before the Roman Empire fell. So it's a statement that takes the message of the scriptures, the message and teachings of Jesus and the apostles while it was still ringing in their ears, and crystallized it in an unmistakable form. And it's been with us for 1,700 years. A summation, a statement that, again, we need now more than ever. It's a statement confessed by billions of Christians over the course of Christian history. One of the things that I mentioned when we kicked off our series is I kind of said, look, here at MAC, we have our traditions. And we have roots in those traditions that go back more than 30 years. We'll be celebrating our 33rd anniversary this October. And then, but that's not where our history begins. We go 300 years back before that to the First Great Awakening in America that launched so much of vibrant faith in the United States. As a Protestant church, our roots go back further than that, another 200 years to the 16th century Reformation, which was a movement within the Catholic Church to return her to her biblical early church roots, which means we look back even further, all that medieval history of the Roman Catholic Church being the Christian church, as well as the Eastern Orthodox Church being the church in the East. We look back, and that's all our history. That's all us. That's all our tributary. We look back all the way through the Middle Ages and through that, all the way back through the Desert Fathers. And we go all the way back. It's all our history. And as a Christian church, we go back even further, another 1,200 years to that summer day in 325, when the First Worldwide Council of Christian Leaders set forth the first and most enduring creed of what the Christian faith proclaims, which, of course, itself looks back another 300 years to a first century man named Jesus, who just happened to be God himself in human form, came to planet Earth, the second person of the Trinity, who came to show us the way. And the Nicene Creed just wanted to make sure that when it came to that way, we didn't lose our way. So it's all our history. It's all our heritage. It's all our roots. We just need to make sure that we stay true to them, and that we make sure that people know that those are our roots. We expose those roots. We drink deeply from those roots, and we don't just act like whatever we are started when this church got started or America got started or anything. It's all our roots, and you don't have to switch over to some other group to somehow access to that. It's all there for us. So when it says it's gotten cool again, I think that's probably what it means.
Well, I mentioned that I wanted to follow up on what you were just talking about before this about heresy, because when I think back to what you said, even at the top of the podcast, about one of the reasons in which the Nicene Creed kind of came into being in the first place was to counteract the heresy that was creeping into the church at that time. That doesn't seem to be a uniquely first century problem. So I was wondering if you could riff a little bit on whether there is a place in the modern church for creeds as a response to a modern day problem of heresy.
Oh yeah. I mean, it certainly does matter. Every word of it still matters, because we can play the whisper game and get it wrong to this day, even about Jesus, the heart of our faith. Let me share a story that I shared with Mac. And so I know you've heard this, but I'll just share it for our podcast listeners. One summer while I was studying at Oxford in England, I was invited to a reception for visiting students, kind of at the start of a learning semester or whatever it was. And when they didn't use the term semester, so I'm coming that out. But within the first 5 minutes, I remember it was the reception was behind Christchurch Cathedral, a little private garden they had there at Christchurch College, which is where I studied. And I found myself in conversation with two women, one from Florida and the other from California. And I think they were just there for like a couple weeks, kind of a continuing ed thing. I'm not sure. But anyway, after exchanging the usual pleasantries, I was asked what I was there studying. And I told them that I was doing some postdoctoral work. They don't call it postdoctoral work at Oxford, but I mean, that's what I call it. I'd finished my doctorate, my PhD at the time, and I was pursuing some additional work there, some additional courses in history. So, but I told them that vocationally, yeah, I mean, I was an adjunct professor at the time, but I was a full-time pastor of a church. Anyway, I was trying to, you know, the woman from Florida just seemed primed. I remember the time she jumped on that. She said, "Well, I'm glad somebody like you is at a place like this so that you can give people the truth, you know, the real story. I mean, why don't more ministers do that?" I remember thinking, you know, all that came out of my mouth was, "I'm not sure I know what you mean." you know, and she said, "You know, all that stuff about Jesus, you know, having died on the cross, resurrected on the third day, all the miracles. He never died like that. In fact, he lived a long, full life, got married, had kids." And I remember thinking, "Oh, really? you know, come on, keep talking to me about this. This is interesting, you know." And I was thinking, mentioning Dan Brown, she's read too many Dan Brown novels. But when I just kind of looked at her puzzled, she said, "Don't you believe that?" I said, "You know, I remember actually thinking at the time, it was this beautiful English afternoon. It was sunny and it was just lovely. They'd given out drinks, Pimm's, vintage English drink, and it was just such a pleasant time. I just didn't want to ruin it. I just didn't want to get into it. But this was a bit much. So I remember searching for the least inflammatory thing I could say. And I remember I said something along the lines of, "I'm sure there are those who might agree with you, but I confess that I am not one of them." And she said, "You mean you believe all that stuff in the Bible?" And I said, I do. And she said, "You mean," I remember she was just like so incredulous. She just blurted out like the most crazy thing she could think of. "You mean like the virgin birth?" And I said, "I do." You could just see it written all over her face. Here was a seemingly intelligent man studying at Oxford who already had one PhD, seemingly working on another, who says he believes in the Bible. And more to the point, embraces historic Christian orthodoxy, flowing from the Bible as articulated by something like the Nicene Creed, which means believing Jesus was divine. There was to her eyes something really wrong with this picture. So, but here's where it got interesting. While the woman from Florida continued to ask questions and kind of bait debate, her friend from California joined with me to try to explain to her that perhaps some of the sources for her radical deconstruction of Jesus and the Christian faith were less than sound. And I was kind of impressed, you know, because so I said, so I'm assuming you're a Christ follower as well. And she says, no. She says, "No, you know, I'm open to it, I guess, you know, but I would still consider myself something of an explorer." And then here's what was funny. Then the woman with whom I've been trying hard not to debate, who'd been saying all this crazy stuff, said, "Well, I would certainly consider myself a Christian." And my mouth just fell open. Whoa, okay. She had somehow, some way failed that whisper test. But so have a lot of people. You and I have talked about this offline, and you've heard me talk about it in other settings too, because it was so interesting at the time. And that there was the annual State of Theology survey that's conducted by Ligonier as well as Lifeway together. And of the 5 most common mistaken beliefs held by Christians about the Christian faith. And you've repeated something like this, Lex, in before some of the Institute classes, where you have listed certain heresies, quite frankly, and asked how many people believe in them. And and you know, we have 70% of our growth coming from the unchurched, and a lot of people who attend our Institute classes who aren't even Christians yet. But so we're not surprised by this, but the amount of not only biblical illiteracy, but even heresy that's accepted is staggering. But get this, of the most common mistaken beliefs held by Christians about the Christian faith across the board, 2 of them were directly tied to Arianism. Two. And this get this. This is really discouraging. 73%, that's almost 3 out of every 4 Christians, agreed with the statement that Jesus is the first and greatest being created by God. 43%, almost half, said Jesus was a great teacher, but he was not God. That's not the public at large. Those are Christians, and that is the direct embrace of heresy.
All right, let me ask you one more question. If a modern Protestant church wants to honor the spirit of the Nicene Creed, but is hesitant perhaps about including it as a regular part of its worship or liturgical life, what alternatives are there?
Well, I kind of alluded to this earlier at the beginning. Well, to honor a creed, or to have the power and utilitarian value of a creed take root in a church, doesn't involve saying it every week. In fact, for a lot of people who grew up with that, they say it just became old and stale and meaningless and just words, and that kind of repetition lost its punch. And, I never even knew what I was saying. I just said it, I'm not saying that's always the case, but I mean, I just think just having it as something you say every week is not necessarily the only way, maybe even not even the best way to have it be a part of the church. But that doesn't mean you lose its power and vitality by going other routes. You can teach on it. As you mentioned, we're in a 5-week series on it right now. Or you can teach a series on modern day heresies, which you've done and others have done, of which Arianism is still front and center. You can pull it out from time to time and recite it. I think that's wonderful, to recite it as a community of faith, or to have it presented in a spoken word creative format, which I think would be just a lot of fun. It can be a part of your worship without it being something that's recited weekly. You can teach on it and about it in theology classes and church history classes. I don't know how you would teach a theology class and church history class and not touch on the Nicene Creed and what it says. And certainly you couldn't teach theology or church history without getting into the heresy of Arianism. It's one of the great heresies and one of the great moments in church history and in the development of the statement of Christian theology. And you can sing it. Another thing you can do. In fact, when we kicked off this series, I asked our creative team I said, look, here's what I want you to do before, if you'll do this for me, before I get up and we do this, the beginning of this series, I said, I want you to dig out the old song by Rich Mullins, Creed, dust it off. It's still wonderful, and I have to introduce my youngins to real good Christian music, like Rich Mullins. And the lyrics of which are based on the Nicene Creed and some of the Apostles' Creed, but it's a wonderful song. And I said, I would love for that to be done. They did a fantastic, fun job with it. But so there's all kinds of ways to keep it front and center, but don't forget the heart and soul of it. The creed was not meant to supplant the Bible. Get that out of your head. It was meant to protect the Bible, to protect its message, to distill the message. It was never meant that you take the creed over the Bible. No. The creed was meant there to help us grasp the Bible and understand the Bible, protect the Bible, to ensure we preserved its core, to state simply and plainly the gospel, the heart of the Christian message. So however you do that, whenever you do that, you are honoring the intent of those Christian leaders of 1,700 years ago.
Well, as always, this has been a very, very fun and very thought-provoking walk down memory lane. And you're always so...
Are you telling me that I have memory of 1,700 years? I know I'm old.
I was just going to add that it is so helpful just because you're so well versed in history and just a way of making history so accessible, and when it can be such a complex topic. So I always really appreciate whenever we get to dig deep into history. So thank you for that. And I know I've gleaned a lot from us walking through this as a church. So if that's of interest to you, those of you who are listening and a part of ministry, maybe consider something like that for you guys as well. But thank you for today's conversation. Thank you all for listening, and we'll catch you again next week.